It all began on a night that seemed colder than it should have been for late November. The streets of a quiet Midwestern town lay under a thin crust of frost, the kind that glitters like glass shards under the dim glow of street lamps. For most people, it was a night best spent inside, huddled near the heater, sipping on something warm. But for Denise Carter, a single mother in her late 30s, the night wasn't offering that kind of comfort. Her small rented home's furnace had been giving out on and off, and the drafty windows made keeping the place warm nearly impossible. Still, she wrapped herself in an old quilt and reminded herself to be grateful that her daughter was asleep upstairs, and grateful that at least they had a roof. Denise worked double shifts at the local grocery store, often pushing her body past exhaustion just to keep food on the table and the lights on. She was the kind of woman who gave even when she barely had enough for herself. People in the neighborhood knew her for her kindness, though most also knew her life hadn't been easy. That night, as the wind rattled against the window panes, Denise heard something unusual. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the groan of the old house. It was faint at first, like a muffled cry. She frowned, stood up, and pulled her shawl tighter as she stepped toward the front door. When she opened it, the icy wind slapped against her face. But it wasn't the cold that made her heart pound, it was the sight in front of her. At the edge of her driveway, just beyond the dim porch light, was a man, broad-shouldered, leather jacket torn, his beard frosted with ice. Behind him was a beat-up pickup truck with steam rising from its hood. Inside the truck, Denise could just make out the silhouettes of a woman holding a small child in the back seat. The woman's arm was around the child protectively, and their faces were pale with cold. Denise hesitated. The man looked rough, the kind of person that would make most people slam their doors. On the back of his jacket was a patch she immediately recognized, even though she'd never seen one in person before, the iconic winged skull emblem of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Her instinct told her this could mean trouble. Everyone had heard stories about them, outlaws, troublemakers, dangerous men you didn't want anywhere near your doorstep. And yet, she couldn't ignore what she saw. That child's face pressed against the glass, lips trembling, was not the face of a threat. It was the face of someone in desperate need. The man raised his hand slightly, as though not to scare her. His voice was rough, hoarse, but there was no aggression in it. "Ma'am. I don't mean to bother you. Our truck broke down. My wife and little boy, they're freezing. Just for one night. Please. We'll be gone by morning." Denise's heart waged war against her mind. Every bit of caution told her not to let strangers in, especially not someone tied to a biker gang. But another part of her, her mother's heart, saw the woman shivering, the child's eyes blinking back tears, and she couldn't bring herself to say no. She opened the door wider. "Bring them in. Quick, before they freeze out there." The man's shoulders sagged in relief. He hurried back to the truck, opened the door for his wife and son, and guided them toward the house. Denise stepped aside to let them in, already feeling the warmth of her decision, even though the house itself wasn't much warmer than the air outside. The little boy, maybe 6 or 7, clung to his mother's side. His cheeks were red, his lips chapped, but when Denise crouched down to his level and gave him a gentle smile, he whispered, "Thank you." It was soft, timid, but sincere enough to bring a sting to her eyes. She led them into the living room, where a small electric heater hummed in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was better than the truck. She fetched blankets, the extra ones she usually kept for her daughter, and handed them over. "Sit. Warm yourselves," she said, her voice firm, but kind. The man removed his jacket, revealing tattoos winding up his arms. He looked tired, worn down, as though life had been heavier than he'd expected. His wife clutched the blanket around her and held their boy close, rocking him slightly. Denise studied them cautiously. "What's your name?" The man nodded, as if acknowledging her right to ask. "Jack. This is my wife, Emily, and our son, Tyler." Denise introduced herself simply, and for a while, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the heater and the faint crackle of wind outside. She went to the kitchen, poured hot water over tea bags, and brought them mugs. She didn't have much, just store-brand tea and a little sugar, but Emily's eyes glistened as she accepted the cup. "You didn't have to, thank you." Denise shrugged gently. "Nobody deserves to freeze out there." The night stretched on. They talked in fragments, Jack explaining that they had been on their way to visit a relative when the truck overheated. No motel nearby had vacancy, and even if they did, money was tight. He admitted he hadn't expected the weather to turn so cold so quickly. Denise noticed something in him, a quiet protectiveness, a constant glance toward his wife and son, as though making sure they were safe. Whatever his patch might have meant to others, to his family, he was simply husband and father. Still, Denise couldn't deny the nerves humming inside her. She had taken in people she didn't know, people who lived a world apart from hers. And yet, as the night deepened, she saw no threat in them. Only gratitude. When morning came, Jack tried to refuse breakfast, embarrassed at the thought of taking more from her, but Denise insisted. She made scrambled eggs and toast, stretching what little food she had, and they ate quietly, the boy smiling for the first time since she'd seen him. Before they left, Jack turned to her at the door. His voice was thick with something he wasn't used to showing, emotion. "Denise, I won't forget this. You didn't have to open your door. But you did. You kept my family safe. I owe you." Denise shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. Just take care of them." Jack gave her a long look, then nodded. He gathered his family, walked them back to the truck, and after tinkering under the hood for a while, managed to get it sputtering down the road. Denise stood at her window, watching until they disappeared into the horizon. She thought that was the end of it. But days later, as she returned home from her shift, something stirred in her neighborhood, something that made people peek through curtains and whisper among themselves. The low rumble came first, like thunder rolling in from a distance. Then it grew louder, sharper, the sound of dozens of motorcycle engines cutting through the quiet streets. Denise froze on her porch as the procession came into view. Row after row of bikes, chrome gleaming under the pale winter sun, leather jackets marked with the same emblem she'd seen on Jack's back. Neighbors gathered at the edges of their yards, wide-eyed, whispering. The bikes slowed, pulling up right in front of Denise's house, engines idling in unison. The sound was deafening, but it wasn't the noise that made her heart race, it was the sheer number. 24, maybe more. The men and women on the bikes were intimidating, every one of them marked by the same patch that once made her hesitate at her door. And then, from the center of the group, Jack dismounted. He removed his helmet, his eyes searching until they locked on hers. "Denise," he called, his voice carrying over the rumble. "You kept my family safe. Now we're here to thank you." The street went silent, except for the steady purr of engines. Denise stood there, her grocery bag slipping slightly in her hand, unsure what to expect as dozens of leather-clad bikers turned their attention to her. Denise's throat tightened as Jack stepped closer, his boots crunching against the frosted ground. The neighbors whispered louder, some clutching their children and pulling them inside. To them, this scene was straight out of a nightmare, dozens of Hell's Angels in the middle of a quiet suburban street. But Denise didn't move. She stood on her porch, her pulse pounding, clutching her grocery bag like it might shield her from what was unfolding. Jack stopped at the base of her steps. Behind him, the bikers cut their engines one by one, until the world seemed unnaturally silent. He took a deep breath and said, "You didn't know me. You didn't know my wife or my boy. But you opened your door. Nobody else would have. Not one soul that night stopped to help. But you did." His voice cracked slightly as he turned to glance at the group behind him. "These men and women are my brothers and sisters. They've stood with me through things I can't even begin to tell you about. But what you did," his eyes came back to her. "That saved my family. And that means more than anything. Denise felt the weight of every gaze on her. She wanted to shrink back inside, but something about the raw gratitude in Jack's voice steadied her. "I just did what anyone should do," she said softly. "No," Jack replied firmly. "Most wouldn't. That's why we're here." He lifted his hand, and one of the bikers wheeled forward a large box. It was set carefully on the porch. Denise blinked in confusion. She crouched and lifted the lid, only to gasp at what she saw inside: bags of groceries, canned goods, boxes of pasta, cartons of milk, even cuts of meat. And beneath that, neatly folded bills, stacks of them, tucked into envelopes. Denise's hand flew to her mouth. I can't accept this," she whispered. Jack's jaw tightened. "You can, and you will. This isn't charity. This is respect. This is gratitude. You opened your home when nobody else would. We're making sure you don't go without." Tears pricked her eyes, but she shook her head slightly. "I don't want people to think I took payment. That wasn't why I did it." Jack's expression softened. "Denise, no one's thinking that. You gave without asking anything back. That's rare. Let us give now. Please." For a long moment, she hesitated. But then she looked down at the groceries, at the bills that could pay her heating bill and fix the furnace that had left her house bitterly cold. She thought of her daughter, who wouldn't have to shiver through another night under threadbare blankets. Slowly, she nodded. Jack exhaled like a weight had lifted. He turned back to his group, and in an instant, the bikers erupted into cheers and revved their engines briefly in celebration. The sound was deafening but strangely triumphant, like a rally cry. Neighbors peeked nervously from behind curtains, some clutching their phones, unsure whether to call the police or stay quiet. But what they saw wasn't chaos. It wasn't danger. It was gratitude, loud and unapologetic. Jack climbed the steps now, standing level with Denise. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small patch, smaller than the ones on their backs, but with the same winged skull design. He held it out to her. "This isn't something we give to just anyone," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "This means you've got friends. If you ever need us, you call. No questions asked." Denise stared at it, trembling slightly. "Jack, I'm not part of your world." "You don't have to be," he replied. "But you stood for my family. That makes you part of mine." Her hand shook as she took the patch, tucking it against her chest. She didn't know if she'd ever use it, but the weight of it, the meaning, was undeniable. The group stayed for a while, unloading more supplies, firewood stacked neatly by her porch, warm clothes for her daughter, even a second-hand space heater. It felt overwhelming, surreal, like she had stepped into a different life for a moment. But as they prepared to leave, Denise noticed something else. The neighbors had gathered at the ends of the street, their expressions uneasy. Some whispered judgment, others fear. Denise knew what they saw: bikers with bad reputations. And she felt a strange urge to speak up, to bridge the gap. She raised her voice. "They're here because I opened my door when a family needed help. That's all. They're not what you think." The words seemed to hang in the air, cutting through the murmur. The neighbors didn't cheer, but some of them shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing they'd been too quick to judge. Jack gave her a small nod of respect. Then, one by one, the engines roared back to life, and the procession began to move, peeling away down the street until only the faint echo of their presence remained. Denise stood on her porch long after they were gone, the groceries and supplies around her, the patch still clutched tightly in her hand. Over the next few weeks, whispers spread. Some neighbors avoided her, shaking their heads at the idea of a woman welcoming outlaws into her home. But others looked at her with new respect, even quiet admiration. And Denise realized something: helping that night hadn't just changed Jack's family. It had changed her. She fixed her furnace. She paid off bills that had weighed on her for months. Her daughter slept warmly at night. But more than that, she carried with her the memory of what it felt like to see gratitude in its purest form, to know that even in a world filled with division and fear, compassion still bridged gaps no one thought possible. Weeks later, while walking home from work, Denise passed a homeless man shivering near the bus stop. People walked around him, clutching their coats tighter, avoiding his gaze. Denise stopped. She thought of Jack, Emily, and little Tyler. She thought of that night. And she knelt, placing her scarf around the man's shoulders, pressing a warm sandwich into his hands. As she walked away, she didn't need thanks. She didn't need recognition. She just knew what she had always believed deep down: kindness, no matter who it's given to, always finds its way back. And somewhere on the road, riding down an endless stretch of highway, Jack and his brothers carried with them the memory of one woman's open door, one night of shelter, that had changed everything. Because sometimes, the smallest act of humanity has the power to ripple outward in ways we can't imagine. And that was Denise's story.